Hello and welcome to the Bulletin with UBS on Monocle Radio. Each week, the sharpest minds and freshest thinkers in finance take you beyond the numbers and hype right to the heart of the big issues of the day. Now, a number of our recent programmes have, understandably, been focused on the United States and next month's presidential election in particular. But today on the show, we're crossing the pond and focusing on Europe. There has been change afoot among policymakers in Brussels, the seat of many institutions that make up the European Union. Geopolitical upheaval and increasing economic pressure have led to a rethink of the bloc's main economic policy priorities. Two recent developments mean that these ideas might be shifting from abstraction into tangible change for the economy and those that invest in it. First, Ursula von der Leyen was confirmed for a second five-year term as the president of the European Commission, with a mandate to redefine the EU's policy programme. Second, at von der Leyen's request, Mario Draghi, formerly president of the ECB, of course, and former Prime Minister of Italy, delivered a detailed report on the future of European competitiveness. The Draghi report outlines a blueprint for what this future might look like and advocates for more focus on economic competitiveness and geopolitical autonomy. So, what are likely to be the implications for the economy, whether straight away or further down the track? What sectors might be affected by the evolving policy? And what will markets require in terms of detail and insight about individual proposals in order to react? Well, to explain the backdrop, explore the report and ponder those potential impacts, we're lucky to welcome back to the show Sam Adams. Sam's an economist in the Chief Investment Office of UBS Global Wealth Management and author of a recent European economy paper on the Draghi report, subtitled A Paradigm Shift for Europe? Sam Adams, welcome back to the show. Let's start, before we get into the details of the report, by looking at the backdrop, that geopolitical upheaval, increasing economic pressure. Talk to us, Sam, about this view that the EU bloc was perhaps overdue a rethink of its economic policy priorities. Time for a shift in those terms?
There definitely has been a bit of a shift in how we should think about economic policy and making sure that environmental policy, economic policy, innovation policy, all those very important goals are a bit more joined up, because we have had these various crises, you could almost call it, over the last couple of years, from the pandemic to the war between Russia and Ukraine and the subsequent energy crisis, the European growth performance slowly falling behind other economies and geopolitical rivals. So there's been an increasing sense in the political landscape that the current direction of travel in how policy wasn't really fit for purpose anymore, and that there should be some sort of change. And we've already seen this kind of come through in the European elections in June, if you remember, where politicians talked much less about environmental goals, but much more holistically about, how do we think about competition policy and how can we set up the European economy in a way that is remains competitive on a global stage.
Yeah, and I guess if we then sort of shift things forward post those elections, we've had, well, with the return of Ursula von der Leyen for a second term as president of the EC, of course, and then this fact that she sort of, at her behest, Mario Draghi, then the former ECB president, of course, was tasked with delivering this report. Do you think that was to address those questions you've described fairly explicitly, right?
Very much so, yeah. I mean, it's quite notable how the report lines up with the actual legislative cycle. Draghi even delayed publication of the report initially to make sure that it has the maximum impact, so that as von der Leyen was confirmed, and now she's setting up her own new commission for the next 5-year legislative cycle, the report lands with very specific recommendations. So von der Leyen was very much inspired by her forward-looking in how she mandated Draghi in setting up the report. And you can also see it in the way that she directed her new commissioners, or presumed commissioners, because they still need to be confirmed, in the objectives and priorities they need to set. So she very much focuses on and references the Draghi report throughout her objective setting.
Now, I thought it was instructive, Sam, in your piece on this published just last week, you made the point that, in order to better understand the report from Mario Draghi and the proposals, it's important to sort of understand the prism through which it looks at this sort of economic malaise that somewhat struck the bloc. Why is that so important? And perhaps you could tell us what that framework is through which we can better understand it.
It is so important because the report is so comprehensive and it touches on so many areas. So if you don't have some sort of organizing framework in mind for why the report frames its recommendations the way it does, it's very difficult to appreciate the report in its full depth and also understand what are the important areas and which areas are perhaps a bit less important from the report's perspective. And basically the report lays out that Europe has been suffering from economic underperformance, mostly due to low productivity growth, especially low investment in the high technology sectors. So think about new technologies such as AI, but other digital technologies as well. And given this economic underperformance and with new headwinds facing the economy, such as competition from China, high energy prices, and decarbonization, there needs to be a joined up framework to address all of those issues at once, essentially, but starting from the very foundational issue that Europe suffers from low productivity.
To generalise, Sam, the solutions outlined in the report take broadly two forms. On the one hand, fiscal policy changes, and on the other, regulatory reform. Talk us through, Sam, what these fixes look like.
So on the fiscal front, which is essentially related to spend and tax policy, there are a lot of ideas around how can we support companies in the decarbonization, in the environmental transition, for example. So, for example, energy-intensive industries that are currently suffering in Europe, they do need more support as standards become more stringent going forward. Can we channel more support in that direction? But there's also, for example, an innovation policy. How do we think about supporting more fundamental research in Europe, which, for example, the US is very strong about? So that's kind of on the fiscal policy side. And then regulatory, you're kind of more generally rethinking the economic framework of the EU. There's a lot around, for example, simplifying legislation, make it easier for small companies to operate across the bloc and achieve a certain level of scale, which makes it easier for investment to take place. But also, how do we think about reforming the financial system so that we can support companies in scaling up and in innovating? So, for example, Europe tends to be very bank-based. How can we shape a financial system that is more organized around capital markets, which are able to absorb more risk? And then that would then go, for example, into pension reform. A lot of areas here, what Russia is, there's kind of fiscal policy regulatory reform.
Now, I think what's interesting, and again, I think you outlined this well in the piece, of course, is that we have to temper our expectations, right, Sam? So, it's unlikely that we see swinging change immediately as a consequence of this. However, if there is this broader agenda, particularly on the regulatory side, we have to try and look at what this could mean over time, right, medium and longer term. Just because we don't see big changes straight away doesn't mean that this isn't potentially going to be very significant. But I suppose, in the report that you authored last week, playfully asked the question, a paradigm shift for the EU, could it be such a thing?
I think we have to be hopeful, but more than optimistic. I think one thing I would highlight is that a lot of the analysis of the report and the recommendations aren't anything that are foundationally new or groundbreaking. I think a lot of policy wonks and economists would have broadly similar view of Europe's economic issues, potential policy solutions. So we do have to wonder and ask the question of, if we already knew what the solutions are, why hasn't it already happened yet? I think here the report is perhaps useful in helping to build this policy momentum and creating a bigger drive for change. But given the history of the European Union and its misses in previous reform attempts, I think we do have to be cautious.
Well, yeah, and I was going to ask you about that, Sam, actually, because it's interesting. Sometimes there is that momentum, isn't there, if you have a new administration comes in, this is the same on a nation state level or for big multinational institutions like this. Can you sort of get something going quickly at the beginning? There's often that maybe a singular opportunity in the first 100 days, is often a cliche, isn't it? Do you think that there is a prospect to move forwards on some of the areas you've outlined already? Energy, capital investment into energy infrastructure, supporting industries make these kind of transitions that you mentioned. Given that there are all these disparate stakeholders, it's always been the case with the EU, lots of kind of conflicts of interest innately, isn't there, in the project? Do you think that is realistic? Or, again, do we just have to be optimistic and say, well, let's wait and see?
Yeah, I think it's, as you mentioned, it's very difficult at the EU level to get anything moving very quickly because you need to coordinate across national levels between the EU and the nations with the private sector. So there are these many stakeholders. So we should be cautious, but I do think there's certain areas where you can make a little bit faster progress compared to other areas. Von der Leyen herself outlined, some priorities she wants to tackle fairly quickly. So, for example, on the industrial strategy, thinking about how we can make energy prices more affordable for consumers and companies. Even if you don't see any immediate implementation of any such policy proposals, at least you can already kick off the conversation fairly quickly. Similarly, on the defense strategy for the EU, so he wants to present a strategy on that fairly quickly in the first 100 days. So at least getting the conversation going and refocusing policy attention onto those areas, I think that you can have fairly quickly. But of course, it will take years until we see any actual change. That is for sure.
Well, yeah, and just one area, a little more detail. In the report, in the Draghi report, it talks about one of the drivers for accelerating innovation, particularly in cutting-edge technologies and industry, is to try and introduce or support a better financing environment, particularly for startups. And this could broaden the appeal to list on European stock markets and so forth. Is that something, Sam, that you think actually, because of the existing strengths of the bloc, may be a little easier to look at?
I think there's certain areas or certain levers you can pull a bit more quickly or a bit more easily. So, for example, where it is about directing European or EU level funding to startups, to more innovative projects, that is something that in principle can change fairly easily. I think where it comes to actually harmonizing capital markets regulation across different countries, or, banking union as a broad stroke project, those have proven to be a bit more difficult to implement in practice because, very understandably so, countries have been very protective of their own financial markets, about their own financial champions. There's been certain kind of areas of contention within the financial sector that are probably difficult to address even going forward, but there are some areas or some solutions that you can address a bit more quickly.
Yeah, Sam, look, we always like on this programme to consider then in a sort of fairly holistic way what all of the issues we discuss mean for the investment landscape. And it's interesting, isn't it? Some of these ideas about longer term reform, shifts in policy direction and so forth, they're often somewhat difficult to move from a relative sort of abstraction into tangible meaning for not just the economy, but for those that invest in it. For that latter cohort, what do investors do? I guess they read your report, right, and make sure that they're keeping up to date as best they can for significant policy shifts or hopefully before even they happen. But how do investors make sense of something, as you say, as huge and complex as the Draghi report to inform decision-making about investment direction, portfolio planning and so forth? Because often it is hard, isn't it, and this is, I guess, you and your colleagues' job, right, to take these things out of abstraction into meaningful, actionable decisions for investors to make.
Yeah, exactly. But as you say, especially when it comes to EU law legislation, it is hugely complex, very comprehensive. So it can be very overwhelming for any one individual to kind of track everything that's going on. But of course, you do want to stay informed about the debate, about the issues. And that's also where we can add some value as well. And as I've highlighted in the report, not all of those ideas, or kind of most ideas, are not immediately actionable from an investment perspective. But eventually, for example, if fiscal incentives get changed for certain industries, that is something that can be an investment catalyst. And that's something that, of course, we in CIO would hopefully be able to foresee and can foretell with enough runway to alert our clients about any such potential changes.
Sam Adams bringing us to the end of this edition of the programme here on Monocle Radio. You can listen again and explore at monocle.com. That's where you can join the club and subscribe to Monocle magazine. You can also follow this programme wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to discover more and find out how UBS can help you by heading to ubs.com. This is The Bulletin with UBS on Monocle Radio. I'm Tom Edwards. Thanks for listening.